Hello, hello. Welcome back, everyone. I am Kevin Curran. And for those familiar, I'm creating this video series to discuss the most exciting developments in biotech. This video is no different. We now have gene editing medicine on the market. And so this is really the first year where we're able to track the earliest developments. How does this medicine distribute? Is anyone taking this medicine? And what does this look like? I'm sitting here in the US, so we're curious, you know, whether sickle cell disease patients will want to take this medicine, will have access to this medicine, and then we can look out globally and look beyond just high income nations like Europe and the US and see how this medicine is or may in the future distribute globally, right? That's a big question with this kind of these advanced biologic medicines like gene therapies, CAR T cell therapies, and now CRISPR-Cas9 based gene editing medicine. So let's get into this. We can start by looking at this quick landscape of gene editing medicine. In the middle here, we see there's only one approved gene editing medicine. So we're looking at FDA approvals here, but that tends to mirror approvals in other high-income nations. So you've got Casgevy in the middle, approved for sickle cell and beta thal patients. And then into late stage phase 3, we've just got Intellia here. That's a different approach. They're going in vivo with a lipid nanoparticle. And then about 10 gene editing companies in early clinical trials, and that's it. And then a huge cluster that are in preclinical. So when we talk about gene editing commercial landscape in 2024, we're really just talking about this one drug, Casgevy. All right, so as I'm going to talk about, Casgevy was brought to market by Vertex through a collaboration with CRISPR Therapeutics, and they licensed out the drug from Editas, and Editas licensed out the IP tech, the CRISPR-Cas9 tech, from Broad Institute, Broad, Harvard, MIT. That the critical kind of experiments from Feng Zhang's lab, 10, 15 years ago, that kind of was awarded the key patent for gene editing used in human cells, in eukaryotic cells. But like everything in gene editing, everything is still sort of under litigation, and IP is never kind of a sure thing. But right now, the gene editing IP and the royalties are moving back down the money chain to Harvard and the Broad Institute. All right, so I've already talked about what this medicine is on earlier videos. I've dug into the science, so this is just a review here. Casgevy, it's approved for treatments of patients 12 years of older with sickle cell, with what we call VOCs, vaso-occlusive crisis. If your hemoglobin is damaged, the red blood cells, they fall apart. They don't hold the right cellular structure. You get poor circulation. Oxygen doesn't reach your tissues. You experience pain, and this is a potentially lethal genetic disorder. And beta thalassemia it's a sort of a slight variation on sickle cell. Also involves it stems from this mutation in hemoglobin. Casgevy, it's a quite a treatment. That we're not talking about a small molecule pill. It's an ex vivo procedure. Bone marrow cells are pulled out of the body. They're treated with the gene editing reagents. CRISPR-Cas9 it's preformed and delivered via electroporation. With a company produced that tech called Maxite, and that lands on this BCL2A mutation, and it prevents the repression of fetal globin. So you get an increase in fetal hemoglobin, and that works. So here's an update on long-term data. 92% of sickle cell patients did not have VOC for at least 12 months. Hemoglobin levels are boosted, and some people had an absence of these symptoms, of sickle cell symptoms, up to 5 years. Okay, so it's incredible. It's incredible scientific milestone. And so now we're hoping that everyone who wants this drug gets access to it. But as we know, that's not how things play out in the pharma world. So that's why we're going to sort of kind of apply like a critical lens here, and it really try to rethink what would need to change to increase global access to these new medicines. So this is from the Vertex website. You can see this medicine it's approved in Bahrain, England, Europe, Saudi Arabia, Scotland, the US, and Wales. In December of 2023, the US approved it. Vertex then released the price, which is a list price of $2.2 million for the therapy. There could be some rebates after that. We don't know, but that is the starting list price coming from the company. Interesting to contrast the approval and pricing process in the US compared to a single payer nation. So the United Kingdom, you would call more of a single payer nation. The federal government has a lot of influence on what the price of the drug will have, that as opposed to the US, where the company for the most part just chooses their price. In the UK, you need to make nice with nice, right? So NICE is the national the cost-effective guidelines program in the UK. They need to sign off on your price, and then the health regulatory agency will move forward, and Vertex gets access to UK patients. We don't know what that number is. I assume it's much less than 2.2 million, but that's a confidential number. So have any patients been treated? This is the latest quarterly report from SEC documents. 20 patients have been collected in those approved nations. In order to distribute, in order to treat sickle cell patients with Casgevy, you have to have an authorized treatment center. As I mentioned, that's not a small ask. You need a medical center with essentially a functioning hematology department and a bone marrow transplant department. So you need to be set up to perform allogenic bone marrow transplants, right? The bone marrow is coming out of the body. It's got to be processed with plasmapheresis and then sent off for the gene editing, and then it returns back to the treatment center and is infused into the patient. It's a long manufacturing process and a long process for the patient, including a lot of conditioning with chemicals, some of them incredibly harsh to the patient, like busulfan. You can see patient estimates from the company Vertex around 35,000 possibly in the US, 23,000 in the Middle East. The company will not get paid until the cells are infused. So analysts can speculate, what type of annual revenue will Vertex do here. Peak sales in 2030 could rise to $2 billion. That's, according to Bloomberg analysts. I've heard other analysts go up to $3 billion. If that proves to be correct, let's say $2 billion is peak revenue 5-6 years from now. If you go with the U.S. list price at $2.2 million, you end up with about 900 patients that would be treated that year. Okay. If other countries bring the average price, net price down to $1 million, you could double that. We could be looking at 2,000 sickle cell patients a year receiving this gene editing drug. Okay. So that's a big number. But the issue is that number pales in comparison to the global population of sickle cell disease patients. So this is an estimate I'm using here. There's about 7.7 million people globally with sickle cell, right? And remember, we were just talking about peak patients treated could be in the 2,000s, maybe to 3,000s. But if that's correct, then it doesn't appear we're even going to dent the prevalent population globally. And the additional challenge here is that 80% of the global patients are in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is an image here from the Global Gene Therapy Initiative group, and you've got it's juxtaposing the prevalence of sickle cell against the wealth of the nations. So each dot is a nation. Here is sickle cell at the top. You can see that we've got the lowest income nations here that have incredibly high prevalence up in the top left. Those are high income nation or low income nations with high disease burden, right? So the problem is, well, the $2.2 million list price, presumably a lower number could be negotiated for low income nations. But the problem on top of that is you need a lot of medical infrastructure to be able to distribute this. This isn't like a vaccine or taking a small molecule pill. Like I said, you need at least a functioning bone marrow transplant department and hematology center in order to deliver this to patients. So this creates some tension, in that this drug is incredible and it's transformative for patients, but it's not clear how it's going to distribute globally. Now, as far as I know, there is no comparable plan in play to get to Sub-Saharan Africa or other low-income nations. As far as I know, I'm quoting here from a journalist, Antonio. He writes for MIT Tech Review. When he interviewed their CSO, the Vertex CSO, in December last year. Vertex so far has no plans to offer its gene editing treatment in those countries where sickle cell is most common. This is a quote, an excerpt from that article. This is from the CSO of Vertex. He's saying he gets this question a lot, of course. It's kind of the obvious question. And he thinks, the answer is, how are we going to distribute globally? Not by trying to do bone marrow transplants in the rest of the world. It's too resource intensive. So there's Vertex sort of pointing the finger at the medical infrastructure piece, which it's not wrong. That is a big impediment, but it's just not the full answer. The full answer is that the list price is also too high, and so there'd have to be some kind of a tiered pricing in terms of the ask price for the list nations as well. But to the CSO's point, it could be that this ex vivo approach where you're pulling cells out and gene editing, this may not be the strategy moving forward. It may be that we need another 5 years or so to come up with a new approach, to sickle cell and possibly, to other genetic disorders where you can use an in vivo administration where you're just going to do a single IV injection of the CRISPR-Cas9 in some kind of a delivery system. So then this can be distributed in, say, Sub-Saharan Africa the same way you distribute a vaccine, right? That may be the route we have to go, and there's a lot of companies moving on that. We know a great target now. We know BCL2A is a great transcriptional repressor to tweak with to modulate sickle cell. So maybe we'll see a small molecule approach, an inhibitor of that transcriptional protein, and so that you boost the fetal hemoglobin levels without having to incorporate gene editing. Sounds like Vertex is interested in that as well. But let's not forget that there is a certain tragedy to the fact that we do have this transformative medicine now, and that it's just a matter of financing and medical infrastructure that is impeding it from distributing globally. That I don't think that sits well with anyone. It's we've got great medicine. You want people that want the drug to have access to it, right? In an ideal scenario. So one way to approach this problem is to look at the business structure to how this technology moved into its commercial state, into the final approved drug, and then sort of run a thought experiment. Think about what could have been done differently in terms of licensing and IP patent transactions in order to build in funding and intentionality towards global access, towards broadening out to all patients, right? So we'll look at just the kind of the main pieces of financial transactions that led to Casgevy, and then sort of rethink how this could have been done a little bit differently. Okay, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but Vertex bought out this medicine from CRISPR Therapeutics for about $1.1 billion in kind of upfront and milestone payments. And now Vertex and CRISPR are co-marketing it. Vertex owns 60% of this. CRISPR owns 40%. 60% of the profits go to Vertex, 40% to CRISPR. CRISPR had purchased this from Editas, and they had purchased a license from Editas for the CRISPR-Cas9 technology, so that now that the drug is on the market, you've got money that flows back to Editas. So there was about $100 million, apparently, that upon FDA approval that went to Editas, and then there's some amount in the 10 to 40 million in yearly licensing until patent expiry, and that's for this CRISPR-Cas9 approach, which was developed in the Broad Institute. So Editas was sort of an extension from those labs there. So then the money, that money received by Editas, some percentage, we don't know the details, this is just from a SEC filing, mid-double-digit percentage of money received from Vertex goes back to the academic labs, to the Broad and to the Harvard group there. So who knows if they're picking up 50%, then that could look like 5 to 20 million annually going back to Harvard Broad. So, and then out the door list price in the US, it's $2.2 million per patient. So one question you can ask is, at what point in this chain of transactions does it make sense to include a provision that ensures patient access for low-income nations or for low-income patients in the US? Academic labs that have developed IP tech, they could add that provision in. There's some funding agencies that are toying around with this. We all know that it's a long shot that you'll ever get a commercialized medicine out of any new tech. But you could, in that kind of 1 in 100 chance of a preclinical piece of technology, if that leads to collecting royalties on commercial revenue, then some percent, maybe 2% of the revenue moving back to the academic labs goes into a fund to broaden out patient access, right? That's one option. And I think the bigger question here is, who is responsible to broaden out access to gene editing medicine, right? I just threw out sort of an IP provision coming out at the academic level. the pharma companies at the top, you know, you could argue they have some sort of social responsibility. They should offer low tier pricing. National governments get involved. Here in the U.S., we're kind of contending with that. We've got price reductions happening at the federal level now. People talk about marching in on patent rights. There's governments that run these low-income nations that have high prevalence for sickle cell. What's their responsibility to get the medical infrastructure up and running, to get, you know, the bone marrow transplant facilities up and running so they're ready to distribute Casgevy? We've got international organizations. They can sort of put pressure and allocate funds and negotiate with governments. The WTO has gotten involved before, NGOs. So I would call all of these top-down approaches to help ensure broad access to gene editing medicine. But we can also approach this from a bottom-up way, and that's really what I was hinting at with the IP provisions is, you know, if we know that a lot of this basic science, the early science on these drug targets, the biology of diseases is being figured out and funded at the academic level or in federal labs like NIH labs, well, then we can build in stipulations there that when that tech transfers out through tech transfer offices, there can be stipulations that a certain % of any commercial revenue moves back towards the funding agency, towards governments, or moves specifically into funding buckets that will be used to broaden out patient access. And the thought experiment that I put forward is that, you know, imagine if Harvard and the Broad had stipulated to Editas when it first moved from, you know, into private hands, that 2% of any commercial revenue from CRISPR-Cas9 IP moves into a fund that is earmarked to enhance patient access, right? So let's assume that they've got $40 million annually, right, back to the academic labs where this work emanated from, you know, after receiving federal funding. So let's say 2% of peak revenue, you know, heading back to the Broad, that could provide something like $40 million annually, right? If we look at 2% of the $2 billion total sales. But that's got to be put in place before this transfers out, right? But that's just an example of a bottoms-up approach where we could there's a little bit more control as opposed to waiting for these big international or the big pharma companies to act on their behalf, right? There's a little bit more agency, you know, by the scientists using this bottom-up approach. All right, I'm actually going to cut myself off right here. There's more I wanted to talk about, but I think this keeps the video concise. We're just talking about the very front end of gene editing medicine moving forward nationally and globally. So we better start having this conversation because we don't want to have this highly unequal world where only high-income nations have access to this transformative genetic medicine. A lot of this has to do with developing technologies that facilitate quick, easy distribution, but the other piece is just the traditional pharma model, especially for rare disease, is set up currently to deliver incredibly high prices on these medicines, and so we need to start thinking outside of the box in terms of how we're going to distribute these readily. All right. Reach out to me, comment, like, subscribe, all that. The more people are interested in these videos, the more I'll keep making them. All right, folks. Take care.